Hello and welcome to Stoicism, Philosophy as a Way of Life. My name is Donald Robertson and today's guest is Eric Cloward. Eric is an executive coach based in Amsterdam who helps leaders build more resilient teams and make better decisions. He is a former tech CTO and software developer. Eric started the Stoic Coffee Break podcast in 2018 to provide people with practical advice on applying Stoicism to their lives. It now has more than 9 million downloads. He has his first book coming out on the 4th of February from Adams Media titled Stoicism 101 From Marcus Aurelius and Epictetus to the Role of Reason and Amor Fati, an essential primer on Stoic philosophy. That's in my top 10 longest titles of books on Stoicism. I've got one that's got quite a long title as well. So you're in good company.
Nice. Yeah, I didn't come up with the subtitle. That was the publisher. Like I got the book and then saw the subtitle and I went, "Oh, okay. I guess that's the subtitle on the book."
Well, I wanted to ask, I usually ask people how they first became interested in this subject, a little bit of background. Like, how did you get into Stoicism? So let's go back a bit in time before the
Yes.
book. Like,
Yeah,
how does
before
it
the
all,
book.
how does it all begin?
So the, throughout my life, I've always been kind of what somebody once called a seeker, meaning I always was interested in psychology, um, habits, just human potential in that. But I always felt like I was kind of underliving my potential for a long time. And anytime that I heard philosophy when I was in high school or college, I thought, oh, that's too out of my league. I'm not smart enough for that. Even though I was a pretty good student, I was actually pretty smart, but my own self confidence in understanding the higher concepts didn't seem like it would fit. And so, like, I had a philosophy 101 class when I was in college, and I barely remember anything from it. I mean, honestly, I even though I thought it was, I remember thinking it was interesting. I remember my teacher, but I barely remember it. And so, about 9 years ago, I was listening to one of Tim Ferriss's podcasts, and he mentioned William Irvine's book, uh, "The Art of the Guide to the Good Life: The Art of Stoic Joy." And he said, "This book changed my life." And I was like, "Okay, that's interesting. I mean, I know Tim reads a lot, but that book changing his life." Okay. And I love the paradox of Stoic joy because I didn't know Stoicism was a philosophy. I only knew the term Stoic. And so I was like, Stoic joy, that's interesting. So I got the book, read through it, got a few things from it, but it didn't quite click. And I thought, you know what, I should have gotten more out of this. And so I got the audiobook and I would listen to it on the way to and from work. And on the second listen, I had so many of those light bulb moments of like, oh, okay, that makes sense. I never thought of that, or I never understood, I never had that kind of perspective on how we think about emotions and how emotions are created. And it honestly, it truly did change my life. Then later that year, I picked up Ryan Holiday's uh, daily journal, I think, right around the new year of 2018, after reading the book and then reading a little bit on Stoicism. So I picked that one up and started journaling on that. And one of my New Year's resolutions was to start a podcast. So I tried making a podcast or two in the past. I wanted to do one on soundtracks because I also like writing music and I love film scores. And so I kind of wanted to do like, here's this new film score, and let's talk about the music and why it's so important. But never really got that launched because I was so hypercritical. And so I was like, okay, I'm going to start a podcast this year. What's my podcast going to be on? And at the time, Stoicism was just really on my mind because of Ryan's journal and because of the reading I was doing. And so on January 4th of 2018, I did my first episode. I used Anchor, which was an app that you could just record it right on your phone. And even though I was a musician, the listening to my voice and editing it felt so overwhelming and created so much anxiety that I didn't want to use my actual expensive equipment, even though I had thousands of dollars of audio equipment. And yeah, so I just talked about what I was learning just every day. And my ex-partner made me make a promise that I would do at least 100 episodes before I quit, because she's like, when things get hard, you tend to quit on things. So you have to make that promise to me. So I did 137 days in a row. So I did one every single day. They were fairly short.
Wow.
And then after 137 days, it had gotten to the point where they were probably about between 5 and 8 minutes long. And I was making notes and I was kind of sketching out episodes. I decided to turn it into a weekly one so I could really dig into it. And also so like I could have my evenings back because I was spending a lot of time on the podcast. And yeah, and it just kind of took off from there. I remember when I hit 5,000 downloads, I was like, holy crap, people are actually listening to what I have to say. This is wild.
Through a party, and now
Yeah,
you're at
it was pretty
billions.
wild. Then I hit 10,000 and then pretty soon I reached the point where I hit 100,000 and um it was just something that I had never expected. I thought I'll just create this and it'll be a practice for when I want to make my real podcast. I'll know how to do it. And then this became my real podcast.
So, what do you think's the secret of your success in terms of like the? Because that's a lot of downloads. There are loads of Stoicism podcasts out there, but not many that reach that many people. What do you think it was about the episodes that like helped them to reach such a big audience?
I think that over time, I kind of developed a fairly strong voice on
Yeah.
being able to clarify Stoic principles in a way that people understood. So I worked in tech for 25 years. And one of the things I was really good at was taking the technical things and explaining them to non-technical people. And oftentimes I would be at trade shows, demoing our software, talking about it, and then I'd hand people my card and they would look at it and be like, "Wait, you're the CTO, you're the tech guy? But I thought you were on the sales team because you're so conversational and you actually can explain these in a way I understand." And I was like, "Well, thank you." And so I think a lot of it comes from I just have a curious mind, and working on these episodes was a way really for me to work out understanding these things. So it was almost like I was journaling about these things in a way so that I could make sense of it. And a lot of the episodes, I'd probably say about 80% of them, maybe 70%, are actual problems that I was facing in my life and figuring out how I could apply Stoicism to actually change those things. And so I think that was a big part of it. And that goes along with the other part that I think is really big is that I'm pretty open and honest about it. Like I talk about a lot of the shit that I'm dealing with in my life and how I actually apply Stoicism. So it's not just here's this highfalutin concept, let me talk about it, but here's something I was struggling with, and here's how I use Stoicism to help me work through some of these things. And I think people relate to that. Um, and it's also my beautiful and charming voice. So
So, well, then I've got a job for you, Eric. In that case, like you sound eminently qualified for the next question, which
Okay.
is, what do people get wrong about Stoicism? So, if you're gonna kind of explain in layman's terms, like what Stoicism is and what it isn't, how would you? What do you think are the most common misconceptions that need to be addressed?
Yeah, I think honestly the biggest one is unfortunately the way that the English language has come about in that we have stoic as now a term for somebody who doesn't show emotions, who suppresses their emotions or, finds a way to not feel emotions at all. And stoicism is not about that whatsoever because obviously you can tell I'm a fairly animated person. I'm not the person who just sits in the corner and, doesn't talk to people. Um, and I think that was my biggest draw to stoicism was he was like, hey, you're going to have emotions. You got to learn how to deal with them in a proper way. And I think that for me was one of the biggest draws of stoicism. And the other big thing that stoicism I think helps people to understand is that your emotions are caused by your thinking. And whereas most people feel like their emotions are things that just happen. A circumstance happens, I get an emotion, I react, and then I get these certain results. And it's kind of like they're on autopilot. So I think that's probably one of the biggest things that people get wrong in Stoicism. Yeah,
Yeah,
I would say that's
I
the
agree.
most.
no one ever accuses Socrates of being like a robot. Have you noticed that?
Yeah. Yeah.
No one's ever accused him of being like Mr. Spock from Star Trek, like for some strange reason. But Diogenes Laertius says that the Stoics got their idea of apatheia, like from Socrates. Um, but no one sees him that way. And actually, when I first began to write about Stoicism, I wanted to write about some of the historical figures like Marcus Aurelius, because I thought it helped to address some of the misconceptions if we look at real examples of actual historical Stoics. So, not many people really would look at Marcus Aurelius and imagine that he's like a robotic guy. Do you know what I
Mm.
mean? Even Seneca as well, he just doesn't come across somehow as
Yeah.
an emotional character. Or
Yes.
Epictetus. Epictetus comes across as quite passionate in some ways, right? He's like an Old
Yeah.
Testament prophet or something. He's not like a
Yeah.
robot.
To me, Epictetus, a lot of his stuff has that very dry humor about things. It's like, I can't escape death, but I can escape the fear of it. I mean, where else am I going to go? I mean, things like that he said. It's just this little sardonic humor that he had. And Seneca, to me, comes across as very warm. I mean, he talks very warmly to Lucilius and he talks about his wife in a very kind and compassionate way. And there's always a warmth that comes across with Seneca, especially.
Yeah.
And I think people miss that.
In Plato's Apology, Socrates, when he's addressing the fact that, I think he's talking about the fact his wife and children aren't in court, and he's talking about how he's not going to cry and beg for mercy and beg for his life in court. But he says at one point, but I want you to understand that, I'm not a man of stone. Like I don't have a heart of stone. I'm a flesh and blood human being. Like, and we find this phrase occurring in the Stoics as well. Cicero uses it. Epictetus uses it. Like following Socrates in the Apology, they all refer to this idea that Stoicism, likewise, isn't about having a heart of stone or being like a statue, as Epictetus puts it. Stoics have natural affection, philostorgia, for example. They're meant to be compassionate, um, and have, so at one point, Marcus Aurelius, in the beginning of the Meditations, he describes the Stoic ideal by referring to one of his teachers. He says the Stoic ideal is to be free from the unruly or irrational passions and yet full of love, or philostorgia. And that's a
Yeah.
neat way of putting it. Not many people think of Stoicism as being a philosophy of love, but he basically says that it is.
Yeah. And I think what people have a hard time understanding, and as I worked on my book, uh, kind of working through that, the Stoics often talk, they talk about making sure that you aren't a slave to your passions. And I think, I had an episode a couple of weeks ago where I was talking about how to get over heartbreak and, how do you let go of a relationship? And so I talked about ideas on Stoic love. And one of the things that I kind of brought up because I think it's very Stoic, even if I couldn't find any direct references on it, is the idea of loving without attachment. And that is that you allow the other person to be exactly who they are and that you don't have any attachment to their behavior. You only show up as how you're going to show up and you be the kind of person you want to be and allow the other person to be exactly who they're going to be. And that for me was really important. Uh, the other thing, kind of going along with passions, is I think a lot of people confuse attraction with love. And they think, oh, I feel this passion, this attraction to this person. I must be in love with them. And it's like, no, attraction is not love. Love is a choice. Love is something that you choose. And even Marcus Aurelius talks about that, uh, when he talks about loving the people who are around you and love them with all your heart. They signifying that it's a choice to love other people. And I think again, understanding that all your emotions, every emotion that you have, besides a fear, a fear response from something, or something like that, is a choice. It's a way of thinking about things. But we kind of get stuck with this idea again that emotions aren't choices; they just happen to us, and we have no control over them. And so we can just react the way that where however we want. But the Stoics, kind of put that big step in there of like, wait, don't confuse how you feel about something, meaning your sensations, the impressions that you feel, with the emotion. Because your impressions you have are your brain turns it into something, then you have an emotion. So the like nervousness and excitement are the same emotion, just one has a positive spin, the other one has a negative spin. But it's the same feeling, but they have the same feeling, but they have different emotions. And I really appreciate, the Stoics' rationality to be able to look at some of those things.
Well, then we'll come to your book in a moment, but as a prelude to that, I wanted to just ask you, why should anyone care about Stoicism? You said a little bit about what it is and what it isn't, and for some of the things you've covered in your podcast. But why do you think Stoicism is important today? Isn't it just ancient history?
I think the reason why I find it so important today is that there are so many chaotic things happening in the world. I mean, the world has always been fairly chaotic, but over the last 70 years, within basically since the end of World War II, the world has been much, much less chaotic than it has been for, many centuries. We haven't had a massive war that's taken out, tens of millions of lives like World War II did and World War I did. But we're reaching a place where life just seems incredibly chaotic. I mean, depression rates among young people and even older people are going up fairly dramatically. Deaths of despair is often what they call it, from drug overdoses, alcohol overdose, alcohol poisoning, and suicide are going up in a very dramatic way. And so I think a lot of people are just kind of losing hope. And Stoicism it's a bedrock, it's an anchor. And the other thing that I like about Stoicism is that it has so many of the principles that we find in today's great religions, but without all the rules, without all the dogma, without all the mysticism that needs to go on top of that. They're just core principles about how to be a good person, about how to withstand the trials of life and be resilient. And I think that's something that everybody use a bit more of.
So, what's your book about? What's Stoicism 101 about? Like, for example, who's it meant for? First and foremost, what sort of readers are you aiming at?
Yeah. So basically, in a sense, it's 60 essays about different topics of Stoicism. And so rather than being, one big, long, complete, building and building and building, I mean, it kind of does that. I ordered the book in a way so that if you're new to Stoicism, you can read about, at the beginning to get a feel for some of the most important points like the dichotomy of control, virtue is the sole good, some biographical points about Seneca and Epictetus and Zeno and Marcus Aurelius. But really, it's taking those ideas. The later chapters are really about taking those ideas and figuring out how you can apply them in different areas of your life, and how you can shift your perspective on things. Uh, I actually got a copy of it the other day, so I was pretty excited about that. Some of the other chapters include Stoicism in the workplace and leadership, Stoicism in
Yeah,
relationships, uh, Stoicism in your body, and the importance of physical care. Obviously, we talk about the main things like apatheia, the logos, oikiokus, and amor fati, which I think are all very important Stoic concepts.
yeah, yeah. That's cool. Uh, and actually, you mentioned leadership, which kind of leads on to something else that I wanted to ask you about in particular, because I know you also do executive coaching. I wondered what aspects of Stoicism you see as being most pertinent in that regard. What does Stoicism tell us about leadership, and how does it come into play in the coaching that you do?
Yeah, I think a big part of that is, especially in leadership, is the dichotomy of control. I think at the first and foremost foundation of that. A lot of people, when they get into leadership positions, assume that now, now that they're in charge, that they run the show. And Stoicism is very much about understanding that you can't control other people. You can ask other people, you can work with other people, you can try to convince other people to come over to your side and do the things you're going to do, but you don't. have control over them, um, I think is probably one of the first and foremost things. And for anybody who's worked with a micromanager, that's huge. But a lot of people, they try to micromanage things because they're trying to control something they can't control. The next big thing is in decision making, understanding the things that are outside of your control, and uh, being able to plan for those things using Stoic ideas of premeditatio malorum, meaning the premeditation of evils. That by sitting down and thinking of everything that could possibly go wrong, as much as you possibly can, then when those things happen, you have at the very least consider the possibility that they might happen. Because if we just go along and think, oh, I've got this plan, we're just going to follow this plan and that's it, and you're not preparing for contingencies, I think you're going to make a huge mistake. And I've worked on plenty of software projects where that was the case, and suddenly we had something come up and just kind of threw the whole thing off track, and then we ended up being a month or two behind because we didn't think, okay, what would happen in this situation? We didn't plan for those contingencies. And then, but if you plan for those, then it allows you to be more resilient because, again, you have at least some idea or some options about things that you can do in those situations. But also, you can recognize, oh, this is something that's outside of my control. Rather than getting stressed about it, I'm going to focus on the few things that I can do in this situation. Because oftentimes we try, again, trying to control things outside of our control. Oftentimes, those are the things that stress us out the most. And by just learning how to have that acceptance of this is beyond, this is above my pay grade, and I'll do the things that I can do down here, then you actually make some progress on it rather than sitting in that worry and that stress.
I guess there's lots of different ways you can. I mean, there's a great deal of stuff in Stoicism that would be relevant to leadership and executive coaching. You could also say, I mean, for example, Marcus Aurelius's Meditations is very popular with people in leadership positions because of his position as Roman emperor. You could look at it in a sense as a kind of manual for applying Stoicism to being in a leadership position.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, for example, where he talks about, there's that famous quote where I actually have it in this episode I was working on today, where he says, begin each day telling yourself, today I shall meet with the, meet with, today I shall meet, today I shall be meeting with interference, ingratitude, insolence, disloyalty, ill will, and selfishness, all of them due to the offender's ignorance of what is good or evil.
Yeah.
And if you can approach business relationships the same way, that you're going to deal with people who are a pain in the ass, whether they be employees, whether they be your own boss, whether they be, customers or vendors that you have to deal with. And most people, when they're acting in a way that feels confrontational or frustrating, it's simply because they're trying to do what they think is best for themselves. And they're trying to do it in the way that they think it's going to actually get them what they want. And if you can recognize that, it allows you to have a little bit of objectivity and to be able to step back from that and go, huh, that's interesting. I wonder why this person thinks that acting this way will get them what they want. Okay, but what is it that they want? You're able to question that a little bit deeper rather than being reactive at their behavior. If somebody says something that you find offensive, rather than being, getting back up in their face and turning it into a shouting match, you can step back and just recognize this is just their opinion. This is just their way of doing things, and handle things with a much more even temper and have a much more productive way of dealing with things.
I think there's also, I've thought about this. Leadership's not really my area, but it's something that I've kind of got involved with a couple of times for various corporate events and things like that. And clients that I've been coaching have asked me about it. And I've thought about it from a few different ways. I thought about at one point, did the Stoics write anything that's really explicitly about leadership? And they do in a couple of ways. One of them is that sometimes they write about kingship, for example, and what it means to be a good ruler. And you might draw some analogies between their attempts to teach someone how to be a good ruler or a good king and the sort of qualities that would be relevant today to somebody who's a CEO or in a leadership position of any kind. There's an essay or a lecture by Musonius Rufus about kingship, for example, where if I remember rightly, he really emphasizes it. He frames it in terms of the four cardinal virtues, and I know that that's an idea that appeals to a lot of people. It's a simple set of pegs to hang some concepts on. We also have
Mhm.
dialogues where Socrates is talking about what it means to be a good ruler, and sometimes he emphasizes things like temperance or self-discipline as being important. I wonder, do you think that the cardinal virtues in Stoicism are, relevant to coaching people in leadership positions?
Yes, absolutely. And that's one of the things that in my book, I emphasize that quite a bit in almost every aspect of it, because, again, the Stoics saw the four virtues as the sole good. Like the only way that you can have a good life is by living those. Whether you're wealthy, whether you're successful, whether you're famous, none of those things lead to a good life. I mean, and we see that all the time with people who are incredibly wealthy, who are incredibly famous, who are incredibly handsome or beautiful, and they're still miserable. That by practicing those four virtues in the way that you treat other people, in the things that you do, always looking for the greater good with everything that you do, then, you know, that's what that's what's going to allow people to, or bring people to your side, because when they see that you have that type of virtue, that they can trust you, that you have that integrity, that you treat everybody fairly, that you practice wisdom, and that you actually learn from your mistakes, and you take your life experience and your education and meld them together to try to make the best decisions possible. And that you're courageous when you step up and you make the right choices and you do the right thing no matter what, even if the market's saying, oh, that's not going to succeed, or you shouldn't be doing that. But then they're also highly ethical, meaning they do their best to not break laws. And in fact, that's not even a consideration in any circumstance. Like, if there are ways to do shortcuts that are unethical or illegal, they don't even consider those things as an option. So you don't have problems with, corporate corruption anymore. And corporate corruption isn't just one person. It usually ends up starting to create a culture around that. When one small thing is allowed, then another small thing is allowed, and then pretty soon it gets stretched a little bit more, and people bend
Yeah.
those rules when they see that there's some allowance to do so, and it creates
Mhm.
a culture of corruption. But if the leader doesn't even allow those things, and those things would never be considered, then you don't even, your chances of something like Enron or Wells Fargo or those types of
Yeah.
things don't happen.
I wonder, Socrates' position, and the position at least of some of the Stoics, is that all the virtues are one, and you can't really have one without having the other ones. They're kind of complementary. But also,
Yeah.
Socrates particularly emphasizes temperance in relation to leadership. And I think one reason for that, seems to me, is that you could have a leader who's a little bit foolish and a little bit unjust and a little bit cowardly. But at least if you know where you stand with them, then you can take account of that. But if someone lacks temperance and self discipline, it means that they're vulnerable to corruption. And it could be that they're really wise and really just and really courageous until they're put into a position of power. And then because they lack temperance, they're rapidly corrupted. And that, I think, potentially makes them more dangerous, because we might make the mistake of trusting them and thinking that we know where we stand with them until they're put in a position of power and they're corrupted by it. And then suddenly they start doing the opposite of what we expected them to do. So we need to know where we stand with people. I think consistency is key in leadership in that regard. It's often the case that we think someone's going to be a good leader and then they turn out to be a terrible leader. And why is that? I think it's partly because uh, once you're in, power corrupts. Uh,
Yeah.
and the remedy for that would be temperance.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's one of the reasons why Cato was so well respected, is because his his temperance and his unbending, dedication to those principles you know, was renowned. And
Mm,
so everybody trusted him, because when he gave his word, that was it. You knew that if Cato said something, then he absolutely meant it, and
yeah.
that was it. There wasn't any like, oh, well, maybe he meant this, maybe he meant that. Does it mean this way? It's just like, or he says that, and then behind the scenes something would happen. It's just like, no, when Cato gave his word, that was it.
Unfortunately, I think people are sometimes attracted to intemperate characters, especially in the field of politics.
Oh yeah.
So when we look at it from that point of view, we might think, I don't know, like some of the leading politicians of today don't really score that highly when we mark them, give them marks out of 10 on the score sheet of the cardinal virtues.
Yeah, unfortunately, because again, it gets back into what we talked about before, the sophists. And people are people have things that they want, they have other agendas, and somebody who's going to speak to that and flatter them and manipulate them are going to attract those kind of people. And I hate to say they're easily manipulated, but we see with a lot of politicians, and this happens quite often. They speak in very kind of general, ambiguous language, which allows it to be open for interpretation. And so people will say, "Oh, well, he's my guy, or she's my gal because they said this," and while it was very open ended, they will interpret it in the way that suits them and to make it mean what they want it to mean. If you
Mm-hmm.
ever study, I'm a big Darren Brown fan, and he talks about that ability to have open language like that, to where things can be interpreted in all kinds of different ways, and it's an easy manipulation tactic. And the sophists were fabulous at that.
Yeah, yeah. I've met Darren Brown. He's I met him years and years ago actually. Like he's really into Stoicism. I mean,
Yeah,
you've probably you've read his book Happy. I don't recommend all that many, but actually, out of all of the self help books and stuff that I've read, it's an odd book in a way, and I don't think its account of Stoicism is completely accurate. But I still thought it was beautifully written and quite insightful and reflective. I thought it was a better uh, discussion of Stoicism in many ways, despite its flaws. I thought it was a more
yeah.
interesting discussion of Stoicism than many of the ones that I've read in other books. Now, you mentioned earlier that one of the things that's appealing, you think, about your podcast is that you're quite open and you talk about your personal experiences and maybe challenges that you've faced so that it's more relatable to the people that you're talking about. My pet subject at the moment, and actually from throughout my life in a sense, has been anger. It's increasingly become important to me, and I think about the reasons for that. I think that it had a kind of hiatus. There was a time when I wasn't all that interested in anger, but as I grow older, I've become more interested in it, and I think in part because when I was a young guy, as I get older, I become more aware of the difference between who I am now and who I used to be. I was incredibly angry when I was a teenager. There were in my early 20s. There were probably reasons for that, but I was very angry. And the poet William Blake said, "The road of excess leads to the palace of wisdom." And he also said, "If the fool would persist in his folly, he would succeed in becoming wise." Now, I don't know if that's good advice, but I think that's what happened to some extent in my case. I was so angry that I reached a point where I thought, this can't go on. I need to change. And so it forced me to start doing something about it. And it was one of the reasons that I became interested in Stoicism. And Stoicism really helped me to challenge the anger that I had very, very deeply. So I noticed on your website, you've got a little personal bio. If you don't mind, I'm just going to read what you said. I don't normally do this, but I think it would be of interest to the listeners and it'd be a good springboard to the next part of our discussion. You said, as someone that often has a short fuse, I found Stoicism made sense in a way that I could use my reason to calm my brain down rather than give in to my usual rash impulses that often led to deep apologies the next day or ended friendships altogether. Stoicism offered a way that used my logical nature to help temper my passionate nature. I can still choose to be angry because at times anger can be a very useful emotion. I can choose to be sad because sometimes I want to feel sad. But as a Stoic, I'm in charge of my emotions, not the other way around. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what I call the problem of anger. And some
Yeah.
people might question if anger always is a problem. So how do you see anger? Like, how did Stoicism benefit you. And one of the things that I'd like to kind of really dig into is like, what aspects of Stoicism do you think are most relevant in this regard?
Yeah. So, in order to kind of dig into that a little bit deeper, I kind of have to go back quite a ways. And my childhood growing up was uh, fairly chaotic in a lot of ways because my dad was randomly angry. So he would be fine for a good portion of the time and then just explode. And so there was this constant, always looking out to test what kind of mood dad was in. It was kind of like living with a drunk, but there was no bottle because he didn't drink alcohol.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so unfortunately, because of that, and because I grew up Mormon, and so Mormon, you're supposed to be always nice and happy. And we used to joke around when the REM song came out that it was about Utah. Everybody trying to be putting on the happy face about things. And so I was very angry with my father, but I wasn't allowed to express that anger in any way. One, because it's not a good Mormon thing to do,
Mm-hmm.
and two, because I was scared of my dad in many ways because he was even though he was shorter than me, he was very powerful. He was very strong. He grew up on a farm, had thick corded forearms like Popeye forearms. And when that anger would get out of control, I remember a couple of times when I was a little kid, running out of the house trying to get away from my dad. And so because of that, I think there was a lot of repressed anger. There was a lot of like, I'm not allowed to be angry about things. And then it would just build up and pop off all the time. Well, not all the time, but just at times when it wouldn't be very helpful. Um, and I'd be angry about things that were fairly minimal, and I didn't understand why I was so angry about a lot of these things. It was part of the reason why my first marriage ended, and definitely a reason why my last relationship of 9 years ended, because there was just all this anger down there, and then I didn't understand how to deal with it in a rational way. Um, and through taking the aspects of Stoicism and that idea of using rationality to examine your thinking, to really practice that self-reflection, to dig deep and to try to look at situations rationally, even if it's after the fact, even if you exploded at somebody and then, but at least being willing to sit down and figure
Yeah.
out what was it that I was really so angry about? What was the thing that what was the real reason? Because oftentimes, like I said, I'd be angry about something that seemed so minor and,
Mm-hmm.
be yelling and screaming about it. But then, looking back on it later, it's like, what did that have to do with anything? Um, but that rationality with Stoicism really helped me to understand that just because I feel something doesn't mean that that's an emotion, but the way that I'm thinking about this situation is the thing that actually generates that emotion, which caused that anger. Um, But Stoicism helped me to become much more mindful about the thoughts that I was thinking and those emotions I was feeling. And really, what it came down to was that if my partner or my ex wife were frustrated with me or annoyed or angry about something that they had every right to be, then what, because of all that trauma growing up, what was happening was that I would have that reaction of basically that little kid of saying, "Oh my God, they don't love me anymore." And so it was
Mm-hmm.
really driven by fear than it was anything to truly be angry about. I was
Mm-hmm.
scared that if they were upset with me, they didn't love me. And so I had to try and control the situation. And part of that control, if I couldn't convince them, was to get angry with them and kind of try to, like my dad
Right.
did, and try and beat them into submission in a way. I mean, I didn't beat
Mm-hmm.
anybody, but verbally. And so but that ability to sit down and rationally look at your emotions, examine them objectively, and to take that beat and to try to develop that self-awareness that Socrates was so big on has been probably the biggest thing from Stoicism. It isn't just one thing, but the ability to, again, rationally examine my own psyche and practice self-awareness and get to know myself in a much deeper way. I think that's been the biggest part of Stoicism. And I feel like because of that, I've been able to be much more accepting about the world. I think amor fati was a huge, huge thing because I think again, I was trying to control things that were outside of my control and getting angry about things,
Right.
getting cut off in traffic, that I can't control the other
Yeah.
person. I can't control what happened. I just accept it, back off,
Yeah.
and arrive safely to work.
It's interesting you mentioned control, like what's trying to control things that you don't control, and the anger giving you a sense of control sometimes. Psychologists sometimes refer to anger as being accompanied by an illusion of control. So, like when we feel things are out of control and we're struggling with certain aspects of a situation, there's something about anger that temporarily makes people feel more in control than they normally are, and that can be a kind of almost a relief in a way. It alleviates some of the anxiety of a situation if you have this kind of false sense of control. But the paradox is, if you look at it from the outside, obviously, it's very interesting to compare the inside perspective from the outside perspective, what it's like to be enraged and what it's like to be observing somebody who's enraged. Angry people do not look like they're in control of the
No.
situation normally, but they often report that they temporarily feel. And also afterwards, you mentioned with the feeling of regret that people often have when they're angry, when they look back in a situation afterwards, um, when they've calmed down, they're no longer angry. People often think, I wasn't in control of what happened in that situation retrospectively. So it's
Yeah.
it's like a weird temporary illusion. So if you don't mind, I want to dig a little bit deeper into what you said, because people often contrast anger with reason, right? So when we're angry, we're not thinking rationally. And one of the remedies for anger is to think things through more rationally. Um, what do you think is the difference between rational thinking and angry thinking? What's different about the perspective of an angry person? So you mentioned how like reasoning with yourself is a kind of remedy for anger. What's the opposite of that? Like what's going wrong like in your mind when you're angry? What thinking errors do you experience when you're angry, for example?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing, there was a quote that I have no idea who to attribute it to, but it said, anger is just fear in action.
Hmm.
And so that response is a way of trying to get in control of things like that. But yeah, when you're angry about something, it's like you feel mentally stupider. You feel like, you I think they've shown that physiologically that parts of your brain do shut down because you're either in a fight or flight
Yeah,
situation, even if there is no real danger to yourself, like you're arguing with your spouse. I mean, unless your spouse is somebody who's violent or anything like that, there's no real physical danger. Um, but yeah, it definitely clouds things, and it does give that sense of some type of control. And
yeah,
yeah, I mean, I know that there are so many times afterwards where I mean, where I said plenty of things that were either untrue or, you know, uh, trying to badger somebody into my side of thinking about things in a certain way. And that, were just kind of ridiculous. And I think back on that now, and some of that was driven by fear that, if this person disagrees with me or doesn't accept my opinion, then they're somehow telling me that I'm wrong. And I don't want to be wrong, because that means that, I rather than just being wrong, that means that I'm a bad person. If they don't
mm,
accept my point of view, then they're disapproving of me. That means I must be bad. Which, when you recognize you can't control other people's opinions, whether that's your
yeah,
partner, whether that's your children, your parents, anybody. And so by accepting that and allowing other people just to have their opinions and be okay with that has brought a lot of peace in my life. Because if I'm in a discussion and somebody disagrees with me, and I'm just like, interesting. I don't know why they have that opinion. We might have a discussion on that, because I'm not tied to their opinion to mean one thing or the other. It's just I can accept it as their opinion. And so I don't try to change it anymore. I try to ask them about it. I try to understand it, maybe convince them. But if they don't like my opinion, they don't agree with it, that's okay. It has no reflection on my goodness or badness. Whereas before, when I was so wrapped up in all my own emotions, my own anger, if I felt that rejection from somebody, then I felt like it was a reflection of me and that I was somehow not a good person because of that. And I think Stoicism allowed me to actually see that in a way that I hadn't been able to recognize before, so that going into those situations, I can just keep an easy touch on things because I'm not invested in having to have somebody else's approval about my thoughts and my opinions, because I know that those are mine and they have theirs.
Now, you mentioned there's something else I wanted to ask you about in the quote that I read from your website. You said at one point that sometimes you could still choose to be angry, and at times anger could be a useful emotion. Do you believe that there are healthy and unhealthy forms of anger? And if so, what's the difference between them?
I think if you recognize anger in certain, uh, life or death situations, I think can be incredibly important. But if you allow that anger to override everything, then that's going to get you into trouble. So it's about recognizing that anger and taking that energy and redirecting it into bravery, as opposed to letting it turn into just all out rage. Because I think being brave in a war zone, or if somebody's going to harm your kids or harm you, having that anger, but being able to turn it again into bravery, it's that same energy, and
Mm-hmm.
using it properly, in those situations is part of what's, kept us alive as human beings. Is that when we feel that fear, are we going to step up and be brave? Are we going to run away? Or are we going to rage about something? And I think bravery is that ability to be able to take that same kind of fear and anxiety and focus it in a more
Uh-huh.
positive aspect. Just like that anxious feeling that you have going out on stage, you can either be terrified, you have to go out on stage and sing in front of 1,000 people, or you can be excited about it. It's the same
Mm-hmm.
feeling, same sensation, just one has a positive spin and the other one has a negative spin. And I think that bravery and rage, or, it can also be that same type of thing.
One of the reasons I think for looking closely at the difference between healthy and unhealthy anger, or questioning even, if there is such a thing as healthy anger, is that if you ask people, in my experience, if you ask people what the benefits of anger are, they'll usually say something along the lines of it kind of gives you more motivation to address injustices, for example, or to exhibit courage in the face of danger. Allows you to be more persistent or more forceful in facing adversity or injustice. But the costs, the downside of anger that you mentioned earlier, is it kind of potentially clouds our judgment and affects our decision making, our ability to
Yeah.
reason. Now, my concern is that these two things don't combine well. That
Yeah.
if I'm more forceful and more persistent, but stupider and worse at making decisions, that seems like a bad combination potentially. Is there a way that we can avoid that problem? Can we channel anger? Can we get? Is it possible to get the benefits of anger without incurring those cognitive costs? I'll give you an example. You mentioned courage. There's research on anger that shows that when people are anxious, it's probably more obvious that they tend to overestimate risk. Right, so anxious people catastrophize. Like they think everything's dangerous.
Yeah.
Like they see threats everywhere. Angry people do the opposite, and they tend to underestimate risk, which in
Yeah.
itself doesn't seem like a big deal. But people who have more energy, more adrenaline, and more persistence and more force, and underestimate risk, often expose themselves to more danger. And also, other people around them are exposed to more danger. So you could say, in extreme cases, angry people get themselves killed, and they get people around them killed as well if they're not careful, like in a conflict situation, like in the military or something. If somebody's
Yeah.
being using anger to make them more courageous, it could be actually it's just making them more reckless if they're not careful because of the cognitive cost, like the underestimating risk. Is there a way around that? Do you think? Uh, can we channel anger in a positive direction without it clouding our judgment?
You know, not in my own experience. I know that most of the times that I've been angry, pretty much all the times I've been angry, I can't think of one where I was thinking more clearly. I I can say there are times when I got angry about something and used that energy to protect somebody, protect myself, and so the outcome was positive, but I wouldn't say that I was very much in control and the risks were a little bit higher. Whereas if I've been able to be a bit more calm and collected about something, but using that same adrenaline and that force, but again, pointing it towards bravery rather than rage, um, probably would have
Right.
been a safer bet. But at in the moment, sometimes rage is what was needed to scare the other person to get them to back off.
Uh-huh.
So but it's like they say in a fight: be more worried about the calm person than the one who's
Yeah.
you know, all bluster and fury.
Well, that leads me on into another. These are hard questions. I don't think there's
Yeah,
a definitive answer to them. There are questions that trouble me and intrigue me, and and they come from ancient philosophy, but they're relevant to modern psychology and therapy and our daily lives. The ancient Stoics defined anger primarily in terms of the desire for revenge, and so did Aristotle and other ancient philosophers. So they saw anger as the belief that someone else has done something that they ought not to have done.
yeah,
So they've acted unjustly. You've done something you shouldn't have. You said something you shouldn't have, and also, therefore, you deserve to be punished. Like, I should take revenge against you. I should punch you in the nose because you said something you shouldn't have said. You acted in a way that you shouldn't have acted. So, I should teach you a lesson, buddy. Like, is the stereotypical thinking. So the Stoics had this cognitive model of psychopathology way ahead of their time, where they would kind of try to interpret our emotions by looking at the underlying attitudes and beliefs. And I wonder, for example, you mentioned be wary of the calm person in a fight. So one of the things I think that goes wrong when someone's angry in a fight is there's when people get very angry. I give you an example actually from ancient history. When ancient people would fight, um, often not that many people would die because they would often rush at the enemy. In ancient kind of tribal warfare, they'd run at the enemy and scream like in the Highland Charge in Scotland, you know, and they try and look scary, and they'd slash at them with sharp-edged weapons like swords, for example, that would kind of cause superficial wounds. They'd keep the other person at a distance, but they kind of wanted to frighten them and hurt them, right? Um, and so it's maybe not the most effective way to actually eliminate an enemy. The Romans trained their soldiers to fight in a more calculated and self-disciplined way, where they would stab people instead of slashing at them, and they'd remain in formation, for example. So in your analogy, like the Romans would be calmer than the so-called barbarians they were sometimes fighting against. So the Romans wouldn't just hurt you or frighten you; they kill you. Like,
yeah,
they'd leave a pile of corpses behind them because they'd run you through with their swords rather than just kind of slashing at you and screaming like and stuff. And so I think that when someone's overtaken by anger and the desire for revenge, sometimes they kind of might attack another person or try to defend themselves in quite an inefficient way. For example, someone's coming at you with a knife. Perhaps what you should do in some situations is try to disarm them, but that's not going to be at the forefront of the mind of an angry person. An angry person is probably going to just be throwing haymaker punches at the other guy while the other guy's stabbing him,
yeah,
right? It takes perhaps more self awareness and a little bit more of a tactical mind, um, in order to exhibit more self discipline, perhaps disarm somebody who's using a weapon against you. That, I think, is how I understand, in part, the risks of anger. Like that, even in because people often say, well, anger could be useful if you're being attacked. But I would question that. I don't know if anger is necessarily the best way to respond to someone attacking you.
Yeah, I would tend to agree with that. Just in my limited experience, I haven't been in too many fights or anything like that. I did wrestle when I was in high school, and um, yeah. And the thing was is that if you really wanted to, if you could egg your opponent on, then get them to
Yeah,
make a bad decision, you often came out ahead like that.
yeah,
I know in martial arts, they often talk about the mental discipline is just as, if not more important than the physical discipline, and that the true
yeah.
masters are the ones who are just very calm and they control the situation because they're controlling themselves. And so other people, when they, when you're when you're coming at somebody angry, yeah, you're not in control of your body, you're not in control of yourself.
You drop
Um,
your guard
yeah, you
often
drop
when
your
you're
guard a lot.
enraged and
Yep.
expose yourself to more danger potentially. The other thing that you do, and this kind of relates to when we talk about anger, it always reminds me of a meme about coffee that says coffee, drink coffee, do stupid things faster and with more energy. So when people say that anger gives you strength and motivates you and makes you more forceful in what you do, it kind of reminds me of this meme about coffee, right? Because the Stoics said anger is temporary insanity; it clouds your judgment, but it
Yeah.
allows you to do insane things faster and with more energy. So hey, that's great. Like,
Yep.
wouldn't that be useful? Um, but one of the risks of that energy, like that sort of adrenaline rush or the caffeine rush that we get from anger, is the apart from all the other problems that you might exhaust yourself. For instance, in boxing, one reason I think for goading an opponent would be that they would throw too many punches and tire themselves
Hmm.
out earlier in the fight. I think that's what happened between George Foreman and Muhammad Ali in the Rumble in the Jungle. Like Muhammad Ali thought, this guy's huge, he's a monster. I can't beat him. But if he loses his temper and I manage to provoke him and I keep my cool, then I can beat him. So Muhammad Ali taunted George Foreman and he lost his temper, and Ali ended up winning the fight. And I
Yep.
think it's partly because George Foreman threw too many punches too early in the match and tired himself out prematurely.
Yeah.
Right. So this is part, but that's directly related to the idea that it's the energy boost, it's the caffeine, it's the adrenaline of anger that's useful. But that might actually be one of the risks
Yeah. I can definitely agree with that.
once that
And
energy is spent.
yeah. And well, and you don't have nearly as much control. So you're gonna overshoot punches. You're gonna do other things like that. If we're talking just in a physical sense, but in an emotional sense of arguing with a partner. I mean, I remember my last partner actually recorded some of our arguments without me knowing. And then she played them back to me later, and I listened. And I'm like, God, some of the things I said were so stupid and so irrational. And I think back now, I'm like, how could I? It was almost embarrassing because I would just hammer a point and hammer a point and hammer a point, and then because not because I knew I was right, but because I wanted her to agree with me. Even though looking back on it, then later when I was much more calm and relaxed, and going, "Wow, I sound like such an idiot." I was arguing over something that was so dumb, where I was taking something that she said and twisting it around and doing all sorts of things that my rational mind would never do, because I know better than that if I was looking at it objectively, but I couldn't at the time because I was so heated up that my cognitive
Yeah.
abilities probably were cut in half at that point.
One of my favorite metaphors is in Plato's Gorgias or Gorgias. Socrates says a lot of weird things. Socrates is known for saying a lot of weird things and paradoxical things. Like everyone likes a good paradox. And he said to his interlocutors, the guys he's talking to, they're really in favor of strong men like Putin today, I guess, is admired by many people and other
Mm,
political leaders for their supposed strength. In the ancient world, it was just the same. So these guys are like admired political tyrants or dictators because of their perceived strength, right? And Socrates said that tyrants he didn't think are actually powerful. And in fact, he said they're among the least powerful people in society. And his interlocutors thought this was crazy. Like, they thought, you're just
Hmm.
talking nonsense. How can you possibly stand there and say that you don't think a tyrant who could commands armies, who could have you beheaded with a click of the fingers, who can make his own laws up and commands enormous wealth, he could kill anyone he pleases. How can you say that he's not powerful? And Socrates says, well, because unless he's also exercising wisdom, it's not true power at all, because he doesn't actually understand what he should be trying to achieve. And so he never achieves what would be in his own best interests or the best interests of society. And I call that powerlessness. He says, let me to explain it to you this way. Suppose I told you that someone had a razor sharp sword and he could use it to kill anyone that he pleases. You could compare this to the strength, the energy, the adrenaline that comes from anger.
Hmm.
It makes him very powerful, right? In the sense that he could just kill him. He could kill anyone, any unarmed man around him. He could kill with this razor sharp sword. But Socrates said, "But what if he's blindfolded? He doesn't. He can't see what he's doing. He's got no idea, like, who he's stabbing, whether it's friend or foe. Would you still describe that man as powerful, even though he's armed and everyone else is unarmed? Or wouldn't you describe him as powerless because he's got no idea whether what he's doing is good or bad? He doesn't know it's friend or foe that he's hurting. He's powerless." And he said the tyrant is like a blindfolded swordsman. Like, he commands huge armies and he can have anyone executed, but he doesn't really understand what he's doing because he lacks wisdom. And I think this is a great analogy also for anger. Like, the angry person is like a blindfolded swordsman. He's got all this adrenaline pumping, the blood coursing through his veins. Like, he's got maybe a temper like the Hulk or something. Like, rage gives us this kind of boost of strength, perhaps, but we don't have
Yeah.
a clue what we're doing. Like, so it's like we have a very dangerous weapon, like, on this fire in our belly, but we're blind, and our judgment is clouded by temporary insanity.
Yeah.
That's how I
Yeah.
understand anger.
Yeah. Yeah. I can definitely see that. It is definitely a loss of wisdom for sure. And, uh, and I can say that from my own experience of having been in plenty of arguments, unfortunately. And it's taken a lot of work to kind of get to the root cause of a lot of that. And that's what I explained earlier. And unfortunately, there's a regret with that. And it's one of those things where I didn't let that regret stop me from trying to improve. I looked at it as, okay, yeah, I did a lot of dumb things. I yelled at a lot of people. I hurt a lot of people that I genuinely cared about because I wasn't in charge of my own anger. I was, that temporary insanity. But Stoicism has given me those tools to be able to look back on those things and to really dive deeper into it, to where I finally
Hmm.
figured out, okay, this is where so much of that anger has been coming from.
Yeah.
And it was really trying to control the other person. And
Hmm.
now that I can just accept that and work through that, then when people disagree with me now, again, I can just be like, okay, I
Yeah.
can just let them have their opinion. I know that I can't control them. And having that at the forefront of my mind in any conversation that might be disagreeable or might become heated, it's not really even an issue. And I can listen to the other person if they're upset from that more compassionate and objective way of like, even if I think they're wrong, this is what they're feeling, and that's okay. I don't need to make a judgment about it. I can just listen to it and accept it for what it is. And then we can actually have a discussion about that. And that diffuses things so much easier.
Hmm. Do you know who you sound like?
Hmm.
Marcus Aurelius. Because he tells us in the meditations that earlier in life, maybe when he was a young guy or whenever, at some point earlier in his life, he said that he had a short fuse. And he said he's just grateful that he didn't do anything that he really regretted looking back on it, because sometimes he had problems controlling his temper. And the meditations is full of advice about anger management. So it looks like he embraced Stoicism in part as a way of controlling his temper. And on the other side, the Roman histories, insofar as they refer to this, they tell us that Marcus Aurelius was known for being someone who was completely unfazed by provocations. So from those little slender bits of evidence, the picture emerges at least of a guy who, as a young man, was worried about his short fuse, threw himself into using Stoicism as a form of anger management, and then earned a reputation for somebody who had succeeded in controlling his
Yeah.
temper and was unfazed. Even at one point, Marcus Aurelius, the Roman emperor, was like a magistrate, and he oversaw legal hearings throughout his career. And later in his life, Marcus Aurelius was overseeing a court hearing, and somebody lunged at him as if they were going to strangle him. And we're told he just stood up and adjourned the hearing until the next day, like he was unfazed by it.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I can tell that I've made progress on it. It's hard to know in a really, if I've made that in a way in a personal or a romantic relationship, because I'm not dating anyone right now. But as an example of something that before I would have been raging about for probably days. When I first moved to Amsterdam, I was trying to find an apartment, and it's very challenging here. And met this guy, showed me an apartment. I paid him some money for it. He was supposed to give me the keys, and he disappeared. Just and changed his phone number. Uh, Basically had lived at different addresses, so there's no way I could track him down. And he stole 5,500 euros from me. And
Yeah.
my first thought when he didn't respond to any of my text messages was like, well, I hope something didn't happen to him. And when I got that sinking feeling that he probably just screwed me over, I was just like, well, definitely made some bad choices on that. I kind of had a gut feeling
Yeah.
that I shouldn't trust this guy, but I really wanted this apartment. Okay, well, you know, I guess I'll file a police report. So I'll do what I can do. But, there was some frustration. There was definitely disappointment because I wanted the apartment and he seemed like a nice enough guy. But, I had some people ask me, it's like, oh, aren't you angry about that? And I was like, well, not really. And they're like, why not? I'm like, because if I sit here and I'm angry and I fume about this thing, I'm choosing to put myself in a bad mood for something that I can't change. And that would be my choice. And so if my choice is to let it go or to sit and stew in this for days or hours, it's just a waste of energy and time, and I'm going to feel awful about it. So why would I
Yeah.
choose to be in a bad mood? And some people are just kind of like, some of my friends were kind of like, huh, I never really thought of it that way, but I guess that makes sense. But still, aren't you mad? I'm like,
Mhm.
I'm frustrated. I'm annoyed. I'm
Yeah.
disappointed, but I'm not angry about it. It's just, that's his nature. He stole from me. It sucks that I trusted this person and I got taken. It's not the end of the world. And so rather than sit and stew in it and be in a bad mood about this thing, I just let it go.
Con men exist.
Yep.
They're out there. Everyone, I think, potentially at some point in their life gets their wallet stolen by a pickpocket in some tourist spot, or they get, somebody rips them off in business. I think we're all like, there's a part of us that wants to believe that other people are honest. And then,
Yeah.
it reminds me of that passage in Marcus Aurelius where he's reminding himself, like, there are deceitful people out there. There are, quite a lot of con men out in the world. You're probably going to encounter some eventually. When things like that happen to me, I think as I get older, I found it harder when I was younger. And, I find it easier as I get older just to reflect on my experience. And I, I don't think this would necessarily help everybody, but I find myself thinking, somebody ripped me off and it cost me a few $1,000 or whatever. And I think, yeah, but there's been like times in my life where I've been lucky as well and I suddenly made a load of money.
Yeah.
So I think it's like on your deathbed or something, you look back and you think, well, there was, especially if it happened a long time ago, say someone ripped you off when you were a teenager, you think, yeah, that's not that time the guy ripped me off. But then there was another time, like I had a kind of windfall, like, and I suddenly made a lot of money. And then when you look at it retrospectively, like it forms more of a rounded picture. You think it's this kind of like, there's good and bad all mixed together in this overall picture. You know, it's not like only bad things have happened. But when things are recent, we tend to focus on them in isolation.
Yeah.
And go, well, it's only just happened. Of course, I'm going to vote light, but we don't have to. We could look at the bigger picture and see it more in a rounded way, alongside positives as well, if we chose to do so. I wanted you mentioned being in Amsterdam, and I wanted to ask you about that. I've been to Amsterdam a couple of times. It's a lovely city, and I went to Spinoza's house. I figured out he must have quite small feet because I went up the stairs. The stairs are tiny. I had to
Well, that's
almost go
just
up on my
Amsterdam.
tiptoes. Maybe that's just the way the stairs are in Amsterdam. Like, did he go out on his tiptoes or did he have really small feet? I don't know. But I found out some other interesting things about Spinoza. I could only have discovered by going to his house. He had an extensive personal library, and they have a catalogue of all the books that were contained in his library. And he had the Socratic dialogues of Xenophon, and he had uh, Epictetus's discourses, and he had Cicero and Seneca. I don't know if he had Marcus Aurelius, but he definitely read and must have been pretty familiar with a bunch of Stoic texts. So sometimes I think in history there are authors that are influenced by other authors, and they'll be quite transparent about that. And then other times I think there are authors that are influenced by other stuff and they kind of keep it to themselves a little bit. And I think it might have been that Spinoza thought, I'm already in trouble. I don't want to broadcast the fact that I'm into Stoicism as well necessarily. I've already been excommunicated. I didn't even know you could be excommunicated from Judaism, but apparently Spinoza was, and curses were placed on him. He was such
Hmm.
a heretical figure, but he didn't mention that he was influenced by Stoicism. I think he may have downplayed that to some extent. He definitely studied the writings of the Stoics. So I wonder, like, what your thoughts are. Maybe this is a good place to kind of to end as well today. With something a little bit more uh, Dutch. What do you think of Spinoza? And do you see him as being a kind of kindred spirit to the Stoics?
I can honestly say I don't know much about Spinoza. So I've heard of him more in passing than anything. Though I have heard some people, I think it was Robert Deutsch was on, I think that's his name, was on Tim Ferriss's podcast and
Mhm.
was very, very complimentary of Spinoza and just talked about some of the things from him. And so he was on my list of people to read. Um,
It's
so
hard
I
to read.
wish that I wish I
Yeah,
knew more about him. I read
unfortunately.
tons of different books from all over the place, but so my list is way too long. When I moved here, I sold my house in Portland and got rid of almost everything that I owned. And I think I probably got rid of, because Powell's is right there, which is one of the largest independent booksellers and used bookstores in the world. I think I easily gave away, 400 or 500 books that I just got rid
Mm.
of. I think I still have like 100 at my brother's place, and
Yeah.
I've shuttled a few over here and my trips back and forth. Um, so Spinoza is definitely one of those on my list.
Have you ever been to his house?
I haven't.
Why not? You should go.
I will.
You should go to Spinoza's house. Is there a statue? There's got to be. I think I had a photograph taken next to a statue of him actually when I was in Amsterdam. There's got to be a statue. There's probably and there must be streets named after him as well. You should go to his house,
Okay.
like, and check out his library. Um, some people have said Spinoza was more Stoic than the Stoics,
Yeah.
but he's not much fun to read. Unfortunately, he's got very kind of he models his style of writing on textbooks of geometry. Like, it's pretty dry, but he does have a bunch of advice about psychotherapy. He saw, like the Stoics, he sees his philosophy as fundamentally also not only a philosophy but also a psychotherapy, a kind of cognitive or rational psychotherapy,
Yeah.
just like the Stoics did. So definitely worth checking out.
Okay.
Um, anyway, I wonder, before we finish, What would you? Where would you advise people to begin if they want to learn about Stoicism and how to apply it to their lives? What do you think? So, if somebody said to you, "I'm just starting to get interested in this Stoicism thing," I heard Tim Ferriss mention it, and it kind of got my interest. What would you suggest that they do next?
Well, first and foremost, self promotion here. Listen to my podcast.
Yeah,
That's a big one. Stoic Coffee Break.
that's allowed.
Yes, and buy my book, Stoicism 101. Because for
Available in
me,
all good bookshops on,
yes,
I don't know, a few days, a couple of weeks or something, is it? 4th of
yeah,
February, I
come,
believe we said.
yeah, 4th of February. So I'm trying to get the pre sales going. So hopefully that'll help boost it in the rankings.
Oh, available for pre-order now, we should say.
Yeah, yes, but
Actually, let me just, as an author, people should pre-order your book because even if they're like, oh, I'll just wait until it comes out. No, pre-order it because it benefits the author. It means that the publisher are more likely to throw more weight behind it, and the retailers are more likely to promote the book and order more copies and stuff. So if you're kind of thinking of waiting until it comes out, you can actually do the author a favor by pre-ordering it instead. Also, on Amazon, you potentially get it slightly cheaper by doing that.
yeah. So I mean, obviously my book, Stoicism 101, it's meant to be that way. So the publisher actually contacted me about a year ago, just as I got to Amsterdam, and asked me if I wanted to write this book because they have philosophy 101, they have ethics 101, religion 101, and so they wanted Stoicism 101. Found my podcast, contacted me on LinkedIn, and said, "Hey, we like your style. We think you have a strong voice and a clear way of explaining these things. Would you be interested in writing a book?" And I'm like, "Well, I actually have ideas for about 5 different books." And like, well, this is what we want, and we think you'd fit really well. And so it's meant to be for those who are just getting into Stoicism for the most part, but it also goes fairly deep, so that even somebody who has been in Stoicism for a while can do that. Above and beyond that, obviously, there's all the greats: Marcus Aurelius, Epictetus, Seneca are all fabulous to read. We mentioned William Irvine's book, The Guide to the Good Life, The Art of Stoic Joy, which for me was my introduction. And so it's one that I like to recommend because William's a good writer and he does a
Yeah.
really good job of taking these harder concepts and going, this is how to apply it in your daily life.
It was the
Man,
first modern bestseller on Stoicism.
yeah, it just really had such a clear way of explaining it. I really appreciated that. I also really enjoyed How to Think Like Socrates. It's a very entertaining book. I love the way that you wrote that. I appreciate the way that you talk about Socrates. And like I said in our interview on that, it's very cinematic. I could totally picture it in my head. I think it would make a great Netflix series. I mean, for me anyway, it would. I don't know if anybody else would be interested in it, but I would find something like that interesting. Um, but really I think there are a lot of great, I think that almost any book that helps you to really think about things in a very different way. There's one book that I found that was incredibly stoic, even though it doesn't mention stoicism once in it, and it's all about leadership. It's called The 15 Commitments of Conscious Leadership, and it's basically how to run a stoic organization. I mean, I remember reading this and like, I read it probably 10 years ago because somebody gave it to me as a gift. I read the first couple of chapters and I was like, oh, that's interesting, but wasn't really in a good headspace to do that. And then again, to bring it back to Tim Ferriss, he interviewed one of the authors on his podcast. And I'm like, I know that name and I know that book. I think I have it. Went out of my library, pulled it out. I'm like, okay, now I'm going to read this. Her name was Diane Chapman, I think, or Diana Chapman. And I started reading it and I was just like, oh my gosh, this is incredibly stoic. This is really how to be a stoic leader, like, and just did a really good job of explaining how to apply all these principles. I mean, a lot of them are like, practicing radical candor, like, allow people the safe space to have their opinions and be able to say what needs to be said. Another one is, about radical acceptance, accepting, you know, radical responsibility. That's what it was. You, if you're in charge, then you are responsible for these things. You may not be to blame for what goes wrong, but you are responsible for those things. And the more responsibility you take, the more power you have in any situation. rather than trying to blame everybody else around you, which the Stoics are very big on, one of my favorite quotes from Epictetus, it's like, if you stop blaming other people, your education has begun. When you stop blaming yourself, then you're becoming a little bit wiser. And when you don't blame anyone, then you have basically gained enlightenment. And it took me a long time to understand that. But what I
Gee.
realized, it was the idea that people are the way they are. Events are going to happen the way they are. Just accept that. And rather than worrying about trying to find anybody to blame, figure out how to be responsible for taking it and fixing whatever's going wrong.
Well, it's easy for you to say that, but we wouldn't have any internet if that was the case. Like, can you imagine what Twitter would be like if nobody blamed anybody for anything? They like a
Might
ghost
actually get
town.
along.
Yeah, like tumbleweed. Like they'd run out of things. They'd run out of things to say to each other.
Yeah.
Like I think.
What's fun? I find that hilarious. I go on Twitter, and anything that's even just slightly controversial, just exploding all over the place, and lots of ad hominem attacks. And they're just, and yeah, I go on Threads, and I find it's a much more inviting atmosphere, which I think is interesting. And I don't
Yeah,
find
I
that
used to think
negativity
all
on there.
social media was like that, but I started to realize maybe it happens over time, but like actually none of them are as bad as Twitter. It seems to be
Yeah.
at the moment. Maybe YouTube comments are pretty bad, but anyway. Well, I think that's been another fantastic discussion, to be honest. So thanks very much for joining me, Eric. Um, we hope that you, the listener, enjoyed the conversation as much as we did. Please share the link with your friends and subscribe to the Stoicism Philosophy as a Way of Life newsletter on Substack for more podcasts and articles and philosophy and psychology and stuff like that. So thanks for listening. And it's goodbye from me, Donald Robertson, and from my guest, Eric Clord.
Thanks
Bye,
for
everyone.
listening, everybody.